Okay, this is Chapter 7, Lecture Video C. We're going to pick up with the thoracic cage. You have the sternum, 12 pairs of ribs, and you have the thoracic vertebrae. And together that forms a protective barrier of the thoracic cavity. And of course it helps shield the heart, the lungs, and many of your great blood vessels. So here's a picture. This is pretty easy. Everybody probably is familiar with the sternum, also called your breastbone. You see your ribs, and then of course back here you see your vertebrae. Okay, so pretty easy there. Here's a picture of the rib. All right, so you'll have some of these in lab to look at. That gets us to the pectoral girdle. Now, the pectoral girdle is where we actually start with appendicular. Okay, and so it has two bones, the clavicle and the scapula, and it supports 30 bones that make up the upper limb, and all of these are parts of that appendicular skeleton. So your clavicle, you probably know this as your collarbone, and then your scapula, you probably know this as your shoulder blade. So the clavicle appears straight, but it's actually S-shaped. This structure helps it to act like a brace, which helps to opposing beams, which again is one of those structure function core principles. And you can see a nice picture of the clavicle right here. Okay, you have the sternoclavicular joint. This is where it meets the sternum, and then you have the acromioclavicular joint where it meets the acromion of the shoulder blade. All right. Another picture, right clavicle, you have a superior view, and then also an inferior view of the pectoral, that clavicle, which is the first part of that pectoral girdle. Alright, so then we have the scapula, which is kind of like a triangular shape. It sits on the posterior superior rib cage between your second and seventh ribs. The body is the big section, and then it has three borders, medial, lateral, and superior. So you can see here's a right scapula. This is an anterior view. So this is the body. Of course, you have a superior border. There's your lateral, and then here is your medial border. Okay, the acromion is the part that connects with the clavicle. Here's your coracoid process, and then right here you can see the glenoid cavity, which is shown there, and it's better in the lateral view. This is what forms your shoulder joint. This is where the head of the humerus meets in that glenoid cavity there. This is the posterior view. You can see the spine, which is that nice crest that goes a diagonal across and forms the acromion, which is the part of your shoulder that you can touch if you were to touch that shoulder. It's the bony projection there. Of course, this will all make a lot more sense when you're able to touch the bone and hold it when you get into lab. That gets us to the upper limb. We have four regions. The brachium, which is the humerus. It's the largest and strongest bone of the upper limb, and it's the only one found in the arm. And then you have the antebrachium, or the forearm. This is your radius and ulna. These are held together by an interosseous membrane. It's a very fibrous cartilage that keeps these connected. Then you have your carpus, or your wrist, which is 8 small carpal bones. You have 2 rows, 4 in each row. And then you have the hand, which consists of 5 long bones, which are the metacarpals, and then your 14 phalanges, which are your finger bones. Alright, so here's the humerus. It gives you an anterior and a posterior view. You can see the head there where it reaches the glenoid cavity of the scapula. Alright, so that's your major shoulder joint there. It shows the greater tubercle, shows the head, your lesser tubercle. You can see the anatomical neck right here. You can see your surgical neck. Down here, you can see your epicondyles, lateral epicondyle, medial epicondyle. You can see the radial fossa, your coronoid fossa, your capitulum, and of course your trochlea. Alright, and then of course you can see on the right, the posterior view, much of the same thing. Except for the olecranon fossa is where your elbow is. This is where the part of your ulna, which is the bony part of your elbow, fits really nicely into that depression there. You can see it's pictured right there, which again, that forms your elbow joint. That gets us to the forearm, radius and ulna. Radius is going to be your more lateral. The ulna is more inferior, medial. Your interosseous membrane is this tissue, this white tissue, this cartilage here that's going to hold these together. The ulna to me is always easy to find because it has a really It's your elbow. I mean, it has a big pointy projection, and you can see right here, look over to the side, this is it. It makes a nice C shape. That's where that trochlear notch fits really nicely into your humerus. The bony part of your elbow is called the olecranon. And then this inside C part is called the trochlear notch. and it's what hinges really nicely with the trochlea on your humerus to form that hinge joint. And then you can see the radius. This kind of has a flat top there, has a head and a neck. You have a radial tuberosity. You have the distal radial ulnar joint, and of course you have a styloid process. You have a radial styloid process, and you have an ulnar styloid process. Okay, so this is a better picture of the elbow joint. All right, so here's an anterior view. Of course, you have your radius here, your ulna here, and then, of course, this is the humerus. So here's that coronary process, and there's the radial fossa. All right, so if you turn around and look at the back, you can see this is the olecranon fossa. All right, this is that nice big opening which the olecranon is going to fit into. All right, so this makes a nice hinge joint. You can see the trochlea, which is that bottom port that also helps form part of that joint between the ulna and of course the humerus there. Okay, that gets us to our wrist and hand. You have 8 metacarpal bones, and we start on the bottom row. So look down right here. Here's your first one. This is scaphoid. To the left of it is lunate. Kind of behind it is triquetrum, and then right here you have pisiform. All right. Then if you go back over to the thumb, you have trapezium. You have trapezoid beside it, a larger capitate, and then you have hamate. All right, so these are the 8 carpal bones. All right, and we have a couple mnemonics that will help you remember that. All right, so here's another picture. Here's your anterior view. Again, we find scaphoid. They always go closer to the bottom, to the radius. Scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum, pisiform, and then trapezoid, trapezium, trapezoid, capitate, hamate. All right, and if you look at the side or on the posterior view, you can see that same thing. You also have the 5 metacarpals, and they're easy. It's metacarpal 1, metacarpal 2, metacarpal 3, metacarpal 4, and metacarpal 5. All right, so you start with the thumb as number 1, and these form, they're long bones, and they form the palm of your hand. And then you have your phalanges here, and these are easy. You have the proximal phalange, middle, and then the distal. And then on your pollex, which is your thumb, you don't have a middle. You just have a proximal and a distal. So this would be proximal phalanx 1, distal phalanx 1. This would be proximal phalanx 2, middle phalanx 2, distal phalanx 2. Okay, so these are all your phalanges, which form your finger bones. Okay, so that gets us to the pelvis, or your pelvic girdle. You have 2 hip bones, or coxal bones. They're also called os coxae. They articulate with the sacrum, and together this makes your pelvic girdle. All right, so the 2 in blue here are your hip, or your os coxae bones, and then the green, of course, is your sacrum. Okay. Lower limb, each coxal bone is composed of 3 fused bones, your ilium, your ischium, and your pubis. They all contribute to the acetabulum. Now, the acetabulum is a very deep socket on the lateral part of your coxal bone. This is where the head of the femur articulates with the acetabulum and forms your hip joint. It's a very deep depression, and it's very easy to see when you pick up the hip bone, and that of course makes a major joint in our body, which is the hip joint. The ilium and the pubis also contribute to the obturator foramen, which is an opening in the coxal bone, and that's where a lot of important nerves and blood vessels travel. So right here of course is the iliac. All right, so it's going to be your top flared region, iliac crest there. This purple region down here is the ischium, so this is like where you sit down. And then you have the pubis, which of course is going to form that pubic area. You see the pubic symphysis, that pad of cartilage there. And then of course it shows you the sacrum. All right, so really good picture there of the pelvic girdle. Really, really nice. All right, so this compares female and male pelvis. You probably know the female pelvis is a little bit wider and shorter, and then you can see the male is a little bit narrower and longer. I'm sure you know the reason for this is, of course, to accommodate childbirth in females. All right, so the lower limb, we again have 4 regions. The femoral, which is your thigh. The femur is the largest and strongest bone in the entire body. It also, we have the patella, which is your kneecap there, which is kind of a triangular shaped bone. Then you have the crural, which is your tibia and fibula. They are also connected by interosseous membrane, just like your radius and ulna in the arm. And then you have the tarsal, which are 7 bones that make up your ankle. And then you have the pedal, which are your 5 metatarsals and your 14 phalanges, which are just like they are in the manus or the hand. So here's your femur and patellar. The femur is easy to find, very large, strong bone in the body. You can see the head and the neck there. Your epicondyles, lateral and medial. And then, of course, you can see your notches. You have condyles and epicondyles there. And that linea aspera is a line kind of on the posterior side. And then it shows your triangular patella, all right, with the base and the apex there. Here's your tibia and fibula. The tibia is much bigger. It's the weight-bearing bone. The fibula is there more for balance. All right, so these are usually really easy to tell the difference in. Your anterior crest right here found on the tibia, that is your shin, which if you hit can be painful. Of course, you can see that interosseous membrane there holding these 2 bones together. You have a medial condyle. You also have a lateral condyle. You can see how the head of the femur is going to fit right there with the tibia. You have a nice tibial tuberosity, which is a projection. Down here we have the medial malleolus, which forms the very inside right before your ankle. It also is painful when you hit it. And then you also have the lateral malleolus, which is formed by the fibula and of course would be on the outside section. And here's your foot. You can see you have 7 tarsals, and you can see calcaneus is this large one right here. It forms your heel. This is a plantar. You can see how big that calcaneus there is. If you look at the plantar, which would be like the bottom of your foot right here. Going back over to the dorsal view, the top of the foot. The next you have the talus, which sits right on kind of on top of the calcaneus. Now this blue is cartilage, so don't think that's part of the bone. That's just the cartilage laying on top of the talus. Here you have the navicular, which is right above, or I'm going to be closer to the toes from the talus. And then you have the row of 4 here. And you start with your big toe, and you have the medial cuneiform. Beside it, the intermediate cuneiform. Then you have lateral cuneiform, and then you have the cuboid. And that's this nice kind of square shaped, larger bone there. All right. And of course, you can look at these on the plantar version as well. Here's calcaneus. Shows a little bit of the talus. Here's the navicular. You can see the cuboid is really big there. And then, of course, you have medial cuneiform, intermediate, and lateral cuneiform. All right. So, again, to find the medial cuneiform, you find your big toe. That gets us to the metatarsals. You have metatarsal 1. Again, you start with the big toe as 1, and then you do metatarsal 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then you have your phalanges, which are the same as your fingers, proximal, middle, and distal. Hallux is the fancy name for your big toe, and you remember that from your body regions. Okay, so that's the foot. Here are some study boosts to try and help remember the bones of the arm and leg. The first one says, stop letting the people touch the cadaver's hand. This helps you remember the carpal bone. Scaphoid, in order, you start on the proximal row and you find your thumb. That gives you scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum, pisiform, and then you go up to the second row, trapezium, trapezoid, capitate, hamate. Mentions hand, so that remember it describes the carpals, not the tarsals. And remember, trapezium is by the thumb. That maybe will help you remember. That's when you start that next row. Tibia and fibula. Tibia is thick inner bone. Fibula is the lateral bone. I'll kind of help you remember which one's which. This college needs me in lab class. Those are the names of the tarsals, from the proximal to the distal and medial to lateral. So you have talus, calcaneus, navicular, medial cuneiform, intermediate cuneiform, lateral cuneiform, and then finally cuboid. So those are just some mnemonics to try and help you remember the order. We have some visual analogies. If you turn the ulna on its side, the trochlear notch is in letter shaded U. That's for ulna. And remember which side you find the radius, make a thumbs up gesture and think of the word radical. This reminds you that the radius is on the same side as the thumb that's making that radical gesture. So kind of silly, but they're very helpful if you can find ways to remember the bones. Some more visual analogies. The radial pulse. Radius is on the same size as your pulse. The patella in Latin means little plate. And so it's like a plate-like shape with a lower limb. And then the navicular bone looks like a boat. Think of the word navy, and that'll help you connect navicular and boat. Okay, whew, that concludes Chapter 7, which concludes the skeletal system.